At its peak, Beaver Lumber was the largest building materials retailer in Canada. 276 stores from prairie hamlets to suburban Ontario, selling the wood for every deck, fence, and finished basement a generation of Canadian men ever built. Then the border opened. A Montreal brewer that had owned the chain for 28 years sold a competing hardware brand directly to Home Depot, then sold Beaver's 138 surviving stores to a small-town Ontario cooperative for $68 million. The name was officially retired on December 15, 2000. The original 1883 lumberyard is a museum exhibit in a Saskatchewan town of 852 people. Not one catastrophe. A long, quiet erasure. Chapter 1. The Bald Prairie. The story begins with a problem no one talks about anymore: the treelessness of the Canadian prairies. In 1882, when a 24-year-old Ontario farm boy named Edwin Ashley Banbury arrived at a place called Wolf Creek in the Quebec Valley of what would become Saskatchewan, the land stretched in every direction without a single stick of commercial timber. The Canadian Pacific Railway had just pushed steel through the valley that year, and settlers were pouring off the trains with government homestead papers in their hands, and nothing above them but sky. They needed houses. They needed granaries, churches, fence posts, barn frames, door lintels. And the Bald Prairie offered them exactly none of it. Edwin Banbury wasn't a lumberman. He was the son of Richard Banbury, a Devon-born English immigrant from Holsworthy who'd settled in Cannington, Ontario, and scratched out a living farming. Edwin and his older brother Robert Samuel had come west the way thousands of young men came west in the early 1880s, following the rails, chasing the promise of free land, carrying the particular optimism of second-generation English Canadians who understood that the empire's newest edge was being drawn across a grassland the size of Western Europe. They homesteaded near Wolf Creek. They watched the town renamed Wolseley, after British Field Marshal Sir Garnet Wolseley, which tells you something about who was naming things in the Northwest Territories in 1882. And they noticed the obvious. Every family stepping off the CPR needed lumber, and nobody was selling it. In 1883, the Banbury brothers opened the Banbury Brothers Lumber Company, Wolseley's first lumber yard. The business model was pure import distribution. Softwood, primarily white pine and spruce, shipped from American Midwest mills, and from Manitoba and Ontario, sold to settlers who were building an entire civilization from scratch on a landscape that couldn't grow the raw material. Edwin and a man named William Dell Purley, whose daughter Edith Elizabeth he would marry 3 years later, had already built Wolseley's first hotel that year, a one-story wood-frame building with a canvas top. The hotel was a speculation. The lumber yard was the real bet. And it paid immediately, because the CPR's branch line network was spinning outward across the prairies like a web, and every town within 30 miles of a new railhead needed a lumber yard within 5 years of the steel's arrival. Edwin Banbury was 39 years old when he made the move that would outlast him by a century. In 1904, he bought out a local competitor, Gibson Lumber Co., owned by a man named R.W. Gibson, whose clerk was a young Brampton-born banker named Robert J. Gorley. Remember that name. Then, in 1906, at a meeting in Winnipeg with representatives of Regina Lumber and Supply Cumber and several other prairie yards, Banbury proposed merging their operations into a single company. Someone asked what to call it. Edwin suggested Beaver. Industrious, woodworking, Canadian. And the name was accepted at once. The Beaver Lumber Company Limited was incorporated in 1906, headquartered in room 47 of the Aikens Block at 221 McDermott Avenue in Winnipeg. Its first general manager was Herbert Crow, formerly of Prairie Lumber Co. Within 2 years, the company had 50 prairie yards. And Edwin Banbury, the man who'd named the thing, quietly stepped aside. He was a regional founder, not a national builder. He'd given the company its name and its origin story, but he would never run the empire that grew from it. He retired to 3636 Dewdney Avenue in Regina, where he lived with a grief most people never learned about. 3 of his 8 children lost to diphtheria, that Victorian prairie killer that arrived in small towns with the same indifference as weather. 2 of his surviving sons served in the First World War. His nephew, Fred Everest Banbury, flew Sopwith camels with 11 confirmed kills before being shot down and killed on April 1, 1918. Edwin outlived nearly everyone. He died on May 10, 1955, at 97 years old, in the same Regina house, having watched his lumberyard grow into the largest building materials retailer in the country without ever sitting in the corner office. The man who would sit in that office for the next 46 years was already inside the building. Chapter 2. The 46-year president, Robert J. Gourley of Brampton, Ontario, had been R.W. Gibson's clerk in Wolseley before the Banbury acquisition brought him into the fold. He was a former banker, precise, patient, numerate, and in 1910, at roughly 30 years of age, he became president and general manager of Beaver Lumber. He would hold the position until 1956. 46 years. One man, one company, through 2 world wars, the Spanish influenza, the Depression, the post-war boom, and the transformation of the Canadian prairies from open homestead into the breadbasket of the British Empire. Gourley was not a flamboyant builder. He was a consolidator who understood something fundamental about the Canadian lumberyard business. The money wasn't in the cities. It was in the small towns, the places where the beaver yard was the only game, where the local manager knew every contractor by name, where the farmer who needed fence posts in April would come back for shingles in August and a wood stove in November. Gourley's strategy was geographic density across the prairies and cautious, methodical expansion eastward when the opportunities presented themselves. The expansion unfolded in stages that tracked the country's own growth. By 1912, Beaver had pushed into Alberta and northern Ontario. The headquarters moved from the Aikens Block to the Bank of Toronto building in Winnipeg in the mid-1920s, a step up that signaled permanence. The Depression hit the prairies harder than almost anywhere in North America. Wheat prices collapsed. Dust storms buried fence lines. Families who'd built their homesteads with beaver lumber watched those homesteads fail. But Gourley survived where others didn't, precisely because his stores were in towns too small to attract competition. When you're the only lumberyard in a community of 400 people, you don't need volume. You need the community to keep existing. And most of them did. Barely, stubbornly, but they did. The war years brought rationing and restrictions on building materials, but also steady demand from military construction. The real transformation came after 1945, and it had a specific institutional name: the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, created by Parliament in 1946. CMHC ensured 25-year low-interest mortgages, first for veterans, then for all qualifying Canadian families. The Federal Wartime Housing Limited program had already given Canadians a pattern book of small, Cape Cod-style 1.5-story houses that could be ordered practically by mail. Section 35 of the National Housing Act funded municipal servicing of suburban subdivisions, water, sewer, roads, which meant that farmers' fields on the edges of towns from Halifax to Vancouver were suddenly worth developing. By the mid-1950s, 2/3 of Canadian housing starts were in the suburbs. Every one of those houses needed studs, plywood, drywall, shingles, paint, hinges, nails, and screws. And in small Canadian towns, that meant the Beaver Lumber Yard. Gourley's critical move during this period was the 1938-39 acquisition of Hessen Lumber in Sault Ste. Marie, completed on March 13, 1939, which opened central Ontario to beaver for the first time. St. Catharines became the Ontario divisional headquarters in the 1940s. British Columbia followed in 1955, giving beaver a coast-to-coast footprint for the first time in its history. There's a personal detail about Gourley worth knowing, not because it explains his business strategy, but because it tells you what kind of man ran this company for nearly half a century. He was a competitive curler, a skip who led the Strathcona Club to the Brier Final in 1931. Curling is a prairie sport that rewards patience, precision, and the ability to think 4 moves ahead while standing on ice in a cold building. It's hard to imagine a better metaphor for Gourley's management style. He didn't make bold bets. He placed his stones carefully and waited for the geometry to open up. By the time Gourley retired in 1956, Beaver Lumber had grown from 50 prairie yards to a genuinely national chain. the largest retailer of building materials in the country. He'd served on multiple Western corporate boards. He'd steered the company through the worst economic disaster in Canadian history and out the other side into the greatest building boom the country had ever seen. The man who replaced him, eventually, through the chain of post-war executives, would be the one who took Beaver Lumber to its absolute peak. And that peak would arrive on a Thursday afternoon in Winnipeg, with a mayor and a pair of scissors and an 18,000-square-foot building that represented everything the company had never been. Chapter 3. The Suburban Boom. Keith Kennedy understood something that Robert Gourley, for all his 46 years of careful expansion, had never fully acted on. The suburbs were the future, and Beaver Lumber was still a small-town chain in a country that was rapidly urbanizing. By the late 1960s, Kennedy, Beaver's president and the most ambitious leader since Gourley, had pushed the store count to a number that should anchor the rest of this story: 276. At its peak in the late 1960s, Beaver Lumber operated 276 stores across Canada and called itself, with justification, the largest retailer of building materials in the country. The Winnipeg Tribune printed that claim on May 29, 1968, and nobody challenged it, because it was true. From prairie hamlets in Saskatchewan to mill towns in British Columbia, from northern Ontario outposts accessible only by rail to suburban Ontario strips where the parking lot was bigger than the store, the Beaver sign was as familiar as the post office. Kennedy's defining gamble was the urban home center. Beaver had always been a rural and small-town operation, the place where contractors loaded 2x4s onto pickup trucks and farmers bought fence posts by the bundle. Kennedy wanted the suburban homeowner, the man with a finished basement to panel, a deck to build, a driveway to edge. On May 30, 1968, Kennedy and Winnipeg Mayor Stephen Juba stood in suits on Stafford Street at Pembina Highway and cut the ribbon on Beaver Lumber's first purpose-built urban home center. 18,000 square feet of indoor retail, a full lumber yard, and a man named Ken Moore managing the floor. Moore was a Beaver lifer. He'd started at the Melita, Manitoba store in 1949 and had spent nearly 20 years working his way through the company to this moment, standing in the biggest store Beaver had ever built in the biggest city in Manitoba. The timing was perfect. Canada's do-it-yourself culture was forming in exactly the image that Beaver served. The post-war suburban house was 10 or 15 years old by the late 1960s, which meant it needed its first renovation. Basements wanted finishing. Garages wanted insulating. Back gardens wanted decks. And the man doing the work, it was almost always the man in that era, drove a half-ton pickup to the lumber yard on Saturday morning, talked to the guy behind the counter about what grade of plywood he needed, loaded the truck himself, and drove home with the windows down and the smell of fresh-cut spruce filling the cab. Beaver's structure was a hybrid that made this culture possible. It wasn't a corporation in the way a department store was a corporation. It was a mix of company-owned stores, especially the urban flagships, and dealer-operated franchises in the small towns, where the local owner was often a community pillar who served on the town council, coached minor hockey, and knew the name of every contractor within a 50-mile radius. These weren't employees. They were independent business people who'd chosen the Beaver banner because it gave them buying power, national advertising, and a brand their customers trusted. By the Molson era, most stores were franchises, which meant Beaver Lumber was really a network of hundreds of small Canadian businesses wearing the same sign. This matters later when the sign changes. Beaver's competitors during this period were real but regional. Cashway Building Centers worked Ontario. Lansing Buildall served the Toronto suburbs. Aikenhead's Hardware, a Toronto institution dating to 1830, sold hardware but not lumber at scale. Kent Building Supplies held the Atlantic provinces. Rona was growing in Quebec. And in a small town in southwestern Ontario called St. Jacobs, a former stockboy named Walter Hatchbourne had co-founded something called Home Hardware on January 1, 1964, after watching more than 1,000 independent Canadian hardware stores close between 1955 and 1965. They couldn't compete with the mass merchandisers, Hatchbourne told the Canadian press years later. I thought there had to be an answer. His answer was a dealer-owned cooperative, the exact model that would, 35 years later, absorb Beaver Lumber itself. But in the late 1960s, Beaver sat at the summit. 276 stores. The largest in the country. A prairie company that had grown into a national institution over 62 years without a single hostile takeover, without a single foreign owner, without a single year when the sign on the building wasn't controlled by people who understood what a Canadian lumberyard was supposed to be. It wouldn't stay that way. Keith Kennedy would be the last president of an independent Beaver Lumber. And the reason had nothing to do with lumber, nothing to do with hardware, and nothing to do with the customers who drove their half-tons to the loading gate every Saturday morning. The reason was beer. Chapter 4. The Brewer's Mistake. In 1971, a man named Donald "Bud" Wilmot decided that the do-it-yourself supplies market was the ideal diversification for a Canadian brewing company. Wilmot was chairman of Molson Industries Limited, formerly a brewer, now a conglomerate. And he'd come to Molson from Anthus Imperial, where he'd built a reputation as a competent acquisition strategist. His logic sounded reasonable in a boardroom in Montreal. Beer growth had slowed, the Canadian market was regulated and mature, and the home improvement sector was growing with every new suburban subdivision from St. John's to Victoria. Hardware, like beer, was Canadian. Hardware, like beer, was a consumer staple. The two industries, Wilmot believed, were natural partners. They were not. Beaver Lumber's shares were widely held. No single shareholder owned more than 10%, which made it the easiest kind of target. Throughout 1971, Molson Industries quietly bought up shares on the Toronto Stock Exchange. By year-end, Molson had paid roughly $40 to $50 million for over 90% of the company, supported in part by backing from Forest Products' giant Macmillan Bloedel. They also bought Aikenhead's Hardware that same year, and Wilson Stationers in January 1972, a retail shopping spree funded by beer profits. The total acquisition cost for Beaver Lumber varies by source. Some say $40 million, some say $50. But the range tells you something about how casually the deal was documented. For Molson, this was a line item. For Beaver, it was the end of independence. Keith Kennedy, the man who'd built the urban home centers and pushed the count to 276, understood what was happening. His letter to Beaver shareholders that fall is the closest thing the company left behind to a written epitaph. Beaver Lumber has developed a proud and widely respected name in the industry. Losing its independence is viewed with great regret by the board of directors. That sentence sat in a formal document surrounded by legal boilerplate. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a call to arms. It was the quiet Canadian acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened, stated with the restraint of a man who'd already lost the fight. Kennedy would depart. The corner office would be occupied by men appointed from Montreal. The decisions about lumber yards in Melita, Manitoba, and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, would now be made by people whose primary expertise was selling Molson Canadian in a regulated market where the government controlled distribution, pricing, and advertising. Molson's own corporate history, published years later, contains a sentence that reads like an unintentional confession. The two industries are very different. The beer industry operates in a controlled market. The hardware industry, on the other hand, operates in a relatively free market. Profits from Beaver lagged behind what Molson had anticipated almost immediately. The brewer's mistake wasn't malice. Wilmot wasn't trying to destroy Beaver Lumber. He was trying to build a Canadian consumer conglomerate, and the logic, on paper, in a boardroom, over drinks, made a kind of superficial sense. But the mismatch was structural. A beer company operates inside a velvet cage. The government tells you where you can sell, at what price, and how you can advertise. Your competition is stable, your margins are predictable, and your customers walk into provincially controlled stores that stock your product by regulation. A hardware retailer operates in the open weather. Your competitors can undercut you by a nickel. Your franchise dealer in Thunder Bay can switch to a rival banner if your service slips, and your customer will drive past your store to a bigger one if you don't keep the shelves full and the prices sharp. Molson had bought a free market animal and didn't know how to feed it. Under Molson, the Beaver Lumber president's office became a rotating door. Alan Keyworth was appointed president around 1975 and pushed the urban home center expansion further. Bigger stores, more suburban locations, trying to capture the renovation dollar from Canadian Tire and the emerging big-box competitors. The strategy wasn't wrong, exactly. It was the right response to how the market was moving. But it was executed by a parent company whose attention was always divided, whose strategic instincts were shaped by a completely different industry, and whose investment decisions for Beaver were always subordinated to the needs of the brewing division. But here's the thing that the brewer's mistake obscures. For the customer standing in the lumberyard on a Saturday morning in 1978, none of this mattered. The sign still said, Beaver. The man behind the counter still knew your name. The forklift still beeped in reverse. The smell of fresh-cut spruce was still the same. Whatever was happening in the Montreal boardroom, the store in your town was still the store in your town. And for about 15 years, that was enough. Chapter 5. The Eager Beaver. Decade. If you were a Canadian man between the ages of 25 and 55 in the 1980s, there's a fair chance you can hum the Beaver Lumber jingle. You might not remember every word. The specific lyrics aren't transcribed in any public archive, and the tune has to be heard on the 3 surviving TV spots from 1987, 1990, and 1991 to be properly recalled. But the melody is in there somewhere, filed alongside the Hockey Night in Canada theme, and the Canadian Tire Money jingle in that part of the brain where Saturday Morning Canada lives. The 1980s were Beaver Lumber's cultural peak, not its store count peak. That was the late 1960s, under Kennedy, at 276. Not its independence. That was gone, sold to Molson in 1971. But the decade when the brand embedded itself most deeply into the texture of Canadian domestic life, when the eager beaver mascot, a cartoon figure carrying a board, industrious and cheerful, not the saccharine eager beaver of children's books, but a working animal, appeared on television, in newspaper flyers, and on the red vests of employees in every province. The TV spots were warm, folksy, family-oriented, the tone of a country that still believed building something with your hands on a Saturday was a normal way to spend a weekend. The 1988 commercial featured a voiceover by Harvey Atkin, a Canadian character actor best known as Sergeant Kolchak on Cagney and Lacey and the voice of King Koopa, whose deep, reassuring baritone made you feel that Beaver Lumber was an institution as solid as the lumber it sold. By 1990, the spots had introduced a spokesperson character named Ernie, a regular guy figure in the mold of the Canadian everyman, who wasn't handy enough to be a contractor, but wasn't hopeless enough to hire one. Ernie was the target customer in human form, the suburban dad who needed someone at the counter to tell him which drill bit to use. System-wide sales reached $307.2 million in 1982. The service center division held 162 retail stores under Molson. Approximately 11,000 people worked across the Beaver network in the mid-1970s. Dealers, yard workers, sales staff, forklift operators, the Saturday morning part-timers, who were usually somebody's teenage son earning gas money. These numbers represented the commercial peak under Molson ownership. Not as many stores as the Kennedy era, but more revenue per store, bigger footprints, deeper inventory. The physical experience of a Beaver Lumber store in the 1980s is what the rest of this story mourns. Walk through the front door, glass and aluminum, nothing fancy, past the distinctive yellow and brown signage with the Beaver logo, and you were in a space that smelled like a forest had been organized into aisles. The indoor retail floor ran 8 to 18,000 square feet depending on the town. Hardware on pegboard hooks, nails sold by the pound from steel bins, a paint mixing counter where a man in a red beaver vest would match your color from a deck of paper swatches and load the can into a mechanical shaker that went thunka-thunka-thunka for 90 seconds while you waited. The cash counter was wood-clad, always wood until the 1990s renovations, and the register still had a bell. Behind the store, through a door or a covered breezeway, was the yard. This was Beaver's soul. Dimensional lumber stacked under cedar-shingled open sheds, 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, 4x4s. And the treated lumber section, where the pressure-treated copper arsenate green wood sat in neat rows, giving off that sharp, vegetal, slightly chemical smell that every Canadian of a certain age associates with deck-building season. Landscape timbers coated in creosote, terry, and sticky, piled near the fence. Plywood sheets leaned in vertical racks. The forklift, yellow, diesel-powered, chains rattling on the mast, was in constant motion, carrying bundles from the back storage to the loading gate, where contractors and homeowners backed their trucks in and loaded by hand. The reverse alarm, beep, 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 was the yard's metronome, the sound that told you the place was alive and working. Saturday mornings were the ritual. A father in a plaid Mackinaw jacket, a son in hand-me-down work boots a size too big, the half-ton Ford or Chevy idling at the loading gate while the old man explained, again, patiently, without condescension but without shortcuts, that you measure twice and cut once, that you always check for crown before you nail a joist, that pressure-treated isn't the same as cedar, and you'd better know the difference before you build anything that has to stand through a Canadian winter. Coffee was sometimes served free at the counter, depending on the store. The manager knew your name. The yard guy knew your truck. It was social infrastructure as much as retail. A place where men who might not otherwise have occasion to talk to each other stood in the same aisle comparing stain colors and offering unsolicited opinions about roofing. Seasonally, the pattern was as predictable as the climate that drove it. Spring, April through June, was the renovation rush. Decking lumber, fence posts, garden soil, exterior paint. Victoria Day weekend was the busiest single day of the year, the unofficial start of building season. Summer was roofing, exterior paint, treated lumber for landscaping projects. Fall meant storm window orders, weather stripping, snowblower sales. And winter was the dead season. Snow piled 3 feet deep on the lumber stacks under tarps. The yard manager's footprints the only marks in the lot. The forklift cold to the touch through work gloves. Indoor retail carried the winter months. Hand tools, ice melt, snow shovels, the Beaver Christmas flyer. The Beaver mascot, in winter advertisements, always wore a toque. But underneath the Saturday morning warmth, 2 cracks had already appeared. In 1985, Beaver Lumber began importing competitively priced merchandise from Asian countries, a defensive cost move that signaled the margins were tightening. The franchise dealers didn't complain, because cheaper inventory meant better margins at their end. But it was a quiet admission that the old supply chain, Canadian and American mills feeding Canadian yards, was under pressure from a globalizing market that hadn't existed when Gourley was placing his curling stones. And in 1987, Molson sold its Quebec stores. The Castor Bricoleur chain, Beaver's French-language operation, was sold to Groupe Val Royal for $10.7 million. It was presented as a strategic realignment. It was, in fact, the brewer's first public acknowledgement that it didn't want to be in the hardware business anymore. The people loading lumber into their trucks on Saturday mornings across Ontario, and the prairies didn't know any of this. They wouldn't have cared, probably, because the sign still said Beaver, and the forklift still beeped, and the paint shaker still went thunka thunka thunka, and the man behind the counter still asked after your kids. What was coming, though, wasn't another crack. It was an invasion, and it would arrive wearing orange aprons, carrying a business model that made Beaver's 18,000-square-foot stores look like garden sheds, backed by a company whose annual revenue was larger than the gross domestic product of some Canadian provinces. The year was 1994. The border was opening. And Beaver Lumber, prairie-built, small-town-hearted, 117 years old, had never faced anything like what was about to cross it. Chapter 6. The Orange Wave. Home Depot was founded in 1978 in Atlanta, Georgia, by 2 men named Bernie Marcus and Arthur Blank, who believed the American homeowner would drive an extra 20 minutes to shop in a warehouse the size of an aircraft hangar, if the prices were low enough and the selection was deep enough. They were right. By 1989, Home Depot had passed Lowe's as the largest home improvement retailer in the United States. By fiscal 1993, its first-half net sales alone were $4.63 billion, implying roughly $9.4 billion for the full year, a figure that made every Canadian hardware retailer, including Beaver Lumber, look like a corner shop. By 1995, 350 Home Depot stores were generating $10 billion in annual revenue across the United States, and the company was looking north. The irony, and it's a bitter one, is that Molson helped open the door. In 1991, Molson had launched Aikenhead's Home Improvement Warehouse, a Canadian copy of the Home Depot warehouse format built on the bones of Aikenhead's hardware, the Toronto institution Molson had purchased in 1971, the same year it bought Beaver Lumber. The idea was to create a Canadian big box before an American one arrived. The stores were enormous by Canadian standards, 50 to 70,000 square feet, far larger than anything Beaver operated. They stocked 25,000 SKUs. They were the brewers' attempt to beat the Americans to their own game on Canadian soil. It didn't work that way. In February 1994, Molson sold a 75% stake in Aikenhead's to the Home Depot Inc. for $150 million. The first Home Depot opened in Edmonton in March 1994. The Aikenhead's employees stayed. The expertise stayed. The store locations stayed. What changed were the aprons, from whatever Aikenhead's had been wearing to the unmistakable orange of an Atlanta-headquartered chain that would grow to 182 Canadian stores and more than 30,000 associates across all 10 provinces. The same brewer that owned Beaver Lumber had delivered the competition to Canada, collected $150 million for the privilege, and left Beaver to fight the result. The timing was not a coincidence. NAFTA took effect on January 1, 1994. 13 days later, on January 14, Walmart Canada was established through the acquisition of 122 Woolco store leases from Woolworth Canada. The big box wave was simultaneous and continental, a restructuring of Canadian retail driven by trade liberalization, American capital, and a format that Canadian companies had neither the scale nor the balance sheet to match. A 100,000-square-foot Home Depot carried 25,000 SKUs at prices Beaver's 8 to 18,000-square-foot stores couldn't touch. The selection was wider. The hours were longer. The parking lot alone was bigger than most Beaver stores. Inside Molson, the calculation was already done. Marshall Mickey Cohen, hired as CEO in 1988 with a mandate to raise sagging returns, had merged Molson Breweries with Carling O'Keefe in 1989, creating a 50-50 joint venture with Foster's of Australia, and the beer side of the business was demanding all of management's attention. In December 1994, Cohen made the announcement that functioned as Beaver Lumber's formal death sentence. Even if the execution would take another 5 years, Molson would divest its home improvement businesses. By January 1995, the liquidation of Beaver's large urban stores had begun. By March, they were all gone. The 18,000-square-foot flagships that Keith Kennedy had built, the stores that were supposed to take Beaver into the suburban future, were shuttered or absorbed into the Aikenhead's Home Depot network. Beaver retreated to what it had always been best at: small towns, rural communities, the places where a 100,000-square-foot warehouse would never make economic sense. The retreat had a human face. In 1995, Ralph Trott was replaced as Beaver Lumber's president by a man named Doug Robinson. Robinson's mandate was not to save the company. It was not to restructure, revitalize, or reimagine it. The trade publication Hardlines described his job in language that left no ambiguity. He was hired to prepare the home improvement retail chain for sale. The store count tells the story in a single declining arc: 276 at the peak, 145 by the mid-1990s, 138 by 1999. The small-town dealers, the franchise operators who'd run their Beaver yards for 10, 20, 30 years, watched all of this from behind their counters. They weren't stupid. They could see the Home Depot flyers landing in their customers' mailboxes. They could count the trucks driving past their stores on the highway, heading to the big orange box in the next city. But they were also independent business people with paid-off buildings and loyal contractors and the kind of community relationships that no warehouse format could replicate. In a town of 2,000 people, the Beaver Yard wasn't competing with Home Depot. It was competing with the idea of Home Depot, with the possibility that your customer might make the 40-minute drive to the city instead of buying from you. Some of them did. Enough of them did. And in Montreal, the men running Molson weren't paying attention to any of it, because they were too busy figuring out how to sell the last thing they'd never wanted to own. Chapter 7. Quebec. Dies first. The story of Beaver Lumber in Quebec is a short, sharp prelude to the story of Beaver Lumber everywhere else, and it happened 6 years earlier. When Molson rebranded its Quebec stores as Castor Bricoleur, castor being the French word for beaver, the name carried the same associations: industrious, Canadian, familiar. The stores served the same function they served in the rest of the country: lumber and building materials for the renovation-minded Quebecois homeowner, sold through a franchise model that relied on local dealers who knew their communities. But Quebec's retail market had its own dynamics, its own competitive pressures, and its own cultural logic, and Molson's patience for managing a hardware chain in a province where the political landscape was shifting beneath everyone's feet was even thinner than its patience for the rest of Canada. In 1987, Molson sold the Castor Bricoleur stores to Groupe Val Royal for $10.7 million. Val Royal folded them into its Brico Centre chain, a regional banner that competed with Rona and the other Quebec hardware operations that understood the francophone market in ways Molson, an English heritage Montreal brewer, never fully had. But Brico Centre was itself a transitional format, too small for the warehouse era that was coming. In early 1993, Val Royal launched Renovated, a warehouse format home improvement chain modeled explicitly on the American big box stores that were about to cross the border. The Castor Brico stores were absorbed, rebranded, or closed. The Beaver name, already translated into French, already one step removed from its prairie origins, vanished from Quebec 6 years before it vanished from the rest of the country. Molson, characteristically, kept a financial toe in the water. It held a 45.1% stake in Renovated, enough to profit from the warehouse format without operating it. In 1997, Molson sold that stake to Castorama, a French retailer, for $147 million Canadian. The math was instructive. Molson had sold Castor Bricoleur for $10.7 million in 1987 and extracted $147 million from the Renovated stake a decade later. The brewer had made money on the transition. The Beaver brand in Quebec had not survived it. The Quebec story matters because it was a rehearsal. Everything that would happen to the rest of Beaver Lumber between 1994 and 2000, the retreat from competitive urban markets, the absorption into a larger banner, the quiet erasure of the name, had already played out in a single province, watched by the same corporate parent that would preside over the national version. If Molson had been paying attention to the pattern, it might have acted sooner, sold sooner, preserved more. But the brewer was distracted by beer and entertained by the $147 million windfall. The lesson was there. Nobody in the boardroom was reading it. Chapter 8. Daniel O'Neill's Knife. In early 1999, a man named Daniel J. O'Neill arrived at Molson from a career at H.J. Heinz and Campbell Soup, two American food companies where the operating philosophy was: identify what the company does best, cut everything else, and return the savings to shareholders. O'Neill had been hired as Chief Operating Officer with a mandate that was as clear as Doug Robinson's had been 4 years earlier, but pointed in the opposite direction. Robinson had been told to prepare Beaver Lumber for sale. O'Neill had been told to turn the beer company back into a beer company. He did exactly that, with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent his career in consumer packaged goods and understood that conglomerates die from the weight of their own distractions. Within 18 months, O'Neill closed the Barrie Brewery, sold a majority stake in the Montreal Canadiens, and disposed of Beaver Lumber. The Globe and Mail would later summarize his tenure in a sentence that functions as a corporate epitaph. Mr. O'Neill, a former executive with Campbell Soup and H.J. Heinz, turned the beer company back into a beer company. His reward was a more than threefold rise in Molson's share price. The Beaver deal was announced in August 1999. The New York Times wire item is dated August 21st, the most defensible specific date in the public record. though Hardline's retrospectives suggest the announcement fell in the last week of August. The buyer was Home Hardware Stores Limited of St. Jacobs, Ontario. The dealer-owned cooperative that Walter Hatchbourne had founded in 1964 after watching 1,000 independent Canadian hardware stores close in a single decade. The price was $68 million, $33 million in cash, $35 million in assumed debt. The Bank of Nova Scotia was the lead lender, with HSBC Canada as participant. The legal architecture tells you how many hands were on this. Gowling, Strathy and Henderson for Home Hardware, with Valet Cottrell and Peter M. Koch leading. Borden and Elliott for the lenders, with William S. Robertson and Daniel F. Hirsch. Ogilvy Renault for Beaver and Molson, with James A. Riley and Michael A. Weinchock. Home Hardware's in-house counsel was Gordon McKay Jr. Hardlines reported that the deal shocked the industry. Home Hardware, a cooperative of 1,100 stores built on Hatchbourne's gospel that, "We're not in the hardware business, we are in the people business," had just absorbed its largest competitor. The deal gave Home Hardware instant scale in lumber and building materials, a category where it had historically been weaker. Beaver brought 138 dealer locations, $747 million in retail sales, and a credible national lumber and building materials business model. It nearly doubled Home Hardware's combined network revenue. Were there other buyers? None surfaced publicly. Home Depot already had the Aikenhead stores. Rona was consumed with Quebec consolidation. Walmart had no interest in lumber yards. Castorama had Reno Depot. By 1999, Home Hardware was effectively the only Canadian-owned chain large enough to absorb 138 stores without choking on them. And it was a cooperative, a model built on the principle that independent dealers owned their own stores and made their own decisions. The Beaver franchise dealers, who'd been running their businesses independently for decades under a distant brewer's banner, were being offered a cooperative model that actually formalized the independence they'd always practiced. For many of them, the change would be nearly invisible. Doug Robinson, the man whose job had been to arrange his own company's funeral, was let go in October 1999, 2 months after the deal. Two Beaver executives, Eric Konechny and Joel Marks, crossed over to Home Hardware. Robinson himself would resurface a decade later as president of Lowe's Canada in 2009. Another American big box entrant. Another echo of the format that had killed the company he'd been hired to bury. The $68 million price deserves a moment's context. In 1971, Molson had paid $40 to $50 million for a 276-store chain that called itself the largest building materials retailer in the country. 28 years later, it sold the 138-store remnant for $68 million, a nominal increase that, adjusted for inflation, represented a catastrophic loss. The brewer had held Beaver for nearly 3 decades, extracted whatever profit the chain could generate while starving it of the capital investment needed to compete with the warehouse format, and then sold it for roughly what it had paid in 1971 dollars. The shareholders were satisfied. The share price rose. Molson became a beer company again. For the franchise dealers in Melita and Sault Ste. Marie and 100 other small Canadian towns, the August 1999 announcement meant something simpler. A new name was coming for the sign out front. The trucks would still deliver lumber. The forklift would still beep. The customers would still come on Saturday morning. But the Beaver would be gone. Chapter 9. The Paint-Over Home. Hardware did not slam the door on Beaver Lumber. It eased it shut. The conversion began in late 1999, accelerated through 2000, and was substantially complete by mid-2001. Beaver Lumber stores were rebranded one by one. Some became Home Building Center. Others became Home Hardware Building Center, depending on the format and the existing Home Hardware presence in the area. The process was methodical, unhurried, and almost gentle, which was consistent with everything Walter Hatchbourne had built since 1964. Hatchbourne was 78 years old at the time of the deal. He'd retired from day-to-day operations in 1988, but he remained the moral center of the organization. And his philosophy, "We are in the people business," shaped how the absorption was handled. Paul Strauss, the CEO who managed the operational integration, executed with the same dealer-first philosophy. The people mattered more than the banner. The franchise dealers, for the most part, simply changed their signs. They'd been independent business people under Beaver, and they would be independent business people under Home Hardware. Their stores occupied the same buildings, stocked the same lumber, served the same contractors, and Saturday morning homeowners. The Ace Hardware Canada contract, Ace had supplied Beaver with hardware products since 1994, was terminated in 2001, replaced by Home Hardware's own St. Jacobs distribution centers. That was the most significant operational change most dealers experienced, a new source for the hardware on the pegboard hooks. The lumber still came from the same mills. The forklift still ran on the same diesel. The corporate office in Markham, 7303 Warden Avenue, where Beaver had relocated its headquarters from Winnipeg in the mid-1990s, in a move that itself told you how far the company had drifted from its prairie roots, emptied out. Corporate staff were laid off or transitioned. The lifers, and there were lifers, people who'd given Beaver 20, 25, 30 years, scattered into an industry that was consolidating around them. The Indeed.com reviews they'd leave years later clustered around the same wistful refrain. "The best place I've ever worked," wrote one former employee. "I was employed by Beaver Lumber for 24 years, wrote another. Home Hardware announced the formal phase-out of the Beaver Lumber name effective December 15, 2000. It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't a press conference. It was an administrative decision communicated through corporate channels. The Beaver Lumber banner would be discontinued. The stores would operate under Home Hardware banners, and the transition would be complete by the following year. One piece survived. The Beaver Homes and Cottages division, Beaver's prefabricated cottage plan operation, which sold architectural plans and material packages for recreational properties, was preserved inside Home Hardware. It operates today at more than 130 locations, selling cottage and secondary suite packages. As recently as October 2024, Home Hardware issued a press release launching the Beaver Homes and Cottages Secondary Suite Collection. It's the brand's only living organ, a vestigial limb of a 117-year-old company, still carrying the Beaver name on plan books in Home Hardware stores, still connecting a handful of Canadian families to a company most of them have never heard of. The death, when it came, was administrative. No bankruptcy auction, no padlocked gates, no final shift ceremony. The brand was dissolved by sign painting, not by liquidation. The paint trucks arrived in small towns across Ontario and the prairies, and the men who climbed the ladders painted over the Beaver, the eager, board-carrying, toque-wearing Beaver that had sold spruce and plywood and nails by the pound for the better part of a century, and put up a new sign and went home. And that was it. Chapter 10. Ruins. The original Banbury Brothers office, the 1883 building where Edwin and Robert started the lumberyard that became Beaver Lumber, still stands in Wolseley, Saskatchewan. It was sold to the Wolseley Museum Association in 1980, moved to Blanchard Street in 1983, and sits there today under heritage protection. Wolseley's population in the 2021 census was 852 people. Edwin Banbury's 1905 house on Front Street is a bed and breakfast now. The Banbury name survives on a war memorial and in the town's heritage tourism brochure. And if you walk the main street in summer, you can find someone who will tell you the story of the two brothers who opened a lumber yard the year after the CPR came through. The Stafford and Pembina store in Winnipeg, the 18,000 square foot urban flagship where Mayor Stephen Juba and Keith Kennedy cut the ribbon on May 30th, 1968, is a no-frills now. Before that, it was a price chopper. Before that, it was something else. The original Beaver concrete loading bay is still visible at the back of the building if you walk around and know what you're looking for. The yellow and brown signage is long gone. 3 subsequent retail tenants have layered their own identities over Beaver's. The bones of the building remember. The skin does not. The Markham head office at 7303 Warden Avenue, where the corporate staff processed the paperwork of their own company's dismemberment through the late 1990s, is now occupied by Lyrico, Brookfield Properties, and TTI. No plaque, no marker, no indication that this was, for a few years, the administrative center of a 117-year-old Canadian institution in the process of being absorbed. Across rural Canada, in Saskatchewan, in Manitoba, in northern Ontario, in small-town British Columbia, dozens of home-building centers still occupy the original Beaver Lumber footprints. Same yard, same fencing, same concrete loading bays, same kiln-dried smell of spruce drying in the sun. The forklift beeps in reverse. The lumber stacks sit under open sheds. The only difference is the sign. And in a few places, if you look carefully, on a wall that hasn't been repainted in 20 years, on the side of a shed that faces away from the road, you can see it. The ghost of the old paint scheme, the faded yellow, the brown border, the outline of a beaver that was carrying a board. The nostalgia lives where it always lives now, online. A Facebook group, a French-language page called Qui se souvient du castor bricoleur? Vintage Beaver Lumber signage on eBay, selling for more than the store's closing day inventory was worth. Pinback buttons, red vests. A 2013 blog post by a band called The All-Overs, titled I Remember Beaver Lumber, which is either a song title or an obituary or both. Redbubble sells Beaver Lumber merchandise to Canadians who were too young to have shopped there and old enough to miss something they barely remember. Beaver Lumber died in the same month as Eaton's. That's worth knowing. On August 20th, 1999, Eaton's, the department store that had been dressing Canadians and furnishing their homes since 1869, filed for bankruptcy, closing 64 stores and laying off 13,000 people. The next day, or close to it, Beaver Lumber was sold to Home Hardware. Two Canadian retail institutions that had survived 2 world wars, the Depression, and the transformation of the country from a colonial agricultural economy to a modern industrial one. Both gone in the same August week, both killed by the same structural forces. American big box competition, NAFTA-era trade liberalization, and the simple, devastating arithmetic that Canadian retailers couldn't match the scale, the selection, or the prices of companies whose domestic market was 10 times larger. A Bay Street advisor told the Globe and Mail after Eaton's fell, Canada is turning into an adjunct of the U.S. retail market. The sentence landed like a diagnosis. It wasn't angry. It wasn't partisan. It was the observation of someone who could read a balance sheet and understood what the numbers meant for the country that had produced them. The lumberyard didn't disappear from Canada. Canadians still build decks and fix roofs and renovate basements. Home Hardware runs more than 1,000 stores. Home Depot runs 182. Rona, bought by Lowe's in 2016, then reacquired by Sycamore Partners, carries on in Quebec. The lumber is still there. The plywood is still there. The nails are still there, though they come in blister packs now instead of being weighed by the pound from steel bins. What disappeared was the beaver on the sign. What disappeared was the particular Saturday morning where the store was small enough that the man behind the counter knew your name, and the yard was close enough that your son could ride his bike there, and the forklift operator waved when he saw your truck pull in because he'd loaded it 100 times before. What disappeared was the franchise dealer who coached minor hockey and sat on the town council and stocked the same shelves his father had stocked before him, under the same sign, in the same building, in a town where the lumberyard was the last place that still felt like it belonged to the people who lived there. Edwin Ashley Banbury's 2 sons and his nephew went to war for the Empire. His 3 youngest children died of diphtheria on the prairies. He built a lumberyard in 1883 because the treeless Saskatchewan grasslands couldn't give settlers what they needed to build a house, and he named it after an animal that was industrious, Canadian, and good with wood. 117 years later, the name was painted over, not by a bankruptcy, not by a fire, not by a catastrophe, but by a brewer's portfolio decision and an orange box from Atlanta and a cooperative from southwestern Ontario that did the kindest possible thing and the most final. It took the stores, kept the people, and quietly ended the name. The original 1883 office still stands on Blanchard Street in Wolseley. The snow comes every winter and covers it, and every spring the snow melts and the building is still there. Heritage protected, patient, waiting for someone to walk in and ask what Beaver Lumber was. If you'd grown up in the right Canadian town, in the right decade, You wouldn't need to ask. You'd remember the smell.